Welcome. I'm happy to have another opportunity to study with you in the book of Matthew. In this lesson, we want to continue with the study of the Sermon on the Mount, and that runs from chapter 5 through 7. And now we're ready to begin the material that's found in Matthew chapter 6. And the first section deals with the practice of giving alms or charity, and also about how not to pray. Jesus is talking again in this context about our righteousness surpassing that of the scribes and Pharisees. Here he talks about general principles and how we should be doing our religious practices, whether it is giving or praying or fasting or whatever it might be, in order to please God and not to be praised by men or to get credit from men, not to be a show-off as far as our religion is concerned, but we have some pure principles and motives in the things that we do. In chapter 6 and verse 1 says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven." So practice your righteousness in a way that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. We're told that the principal commandments of the law were to love God with all of your heart and your soul and your might. And the second commandment was to love your neighbor as yourself. And these are what the whole law hung on. And Jesus' disciples, of course, should recognize that righteousness is connected with the way that we treat our fellow man. And we saw that in chapter 5. And here we see the way that we should practice our righteousness in connection with God in chapter 6. Righteousness in connection with man is in chapter 7. There's some examples of how religion should be practiced in giving alms in verses 2 through 4, how we should pray or not pray in verses 5 through 15, and how to go about the practice of fasting. Should we do that? In verses 16 through 18. So our righteous practices should be done to give glory to God. We want to do our good works in order that God may be glorified, that He may be pleased, that we may receive reward from Him. It's not about doing things to receive the praise of men. It's not about us. Jesus deals with motives in this section we're studying. Righteous practice of men's praise is not going to be rewarded by God. That is Jesus' point. One receives the praise that he seeks. If you seek the praise of men and you get that, you're paid in full. If you seek the praise of God in the things that you do, then you'll receive the reward from God. Fraudulent religious exercise is what Jesus is condemning. Acts of dissimulation, of hypocrisy, of being a phony, showing off for effect in the eyes of others is what is condemned. The all-wise God that looks at all that we do can't be fooled, He can't be deceived. So we need to practice our religion honestly from our hearts. When, therefore, you give alms, do not sound the trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. So Jesus gives the example, a common practice among the Jewish people of giving alms. The root of the word that is used there is giving pity, giving compassion. And it may not just be limited to money, but a specific example of that, and it's certainly used to talk about specifically giving alms in some verses and some occasions. So the law expects as an individual, we are to look out for our needy family, needy people that are in our church, that we should look out for anyone that we have opportunity to help. In the book of Deuteronomy, you can see that this was a part of the law of Moses. If there is a poor man with you one of your brothers in any of your towns in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor close your hand from your poor brother. But you shall freely open your hand to him. You shall generously lend him sufficiently for his needs and whatever he lacks. Leviticus 25:35. Now, in case a countryman of yours becomes poor and his means with regard to you falters, then you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. And Job talks about his practice of almsgiving. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case, which I did not know, and he tried to do what he could to help. And the same thing is expected of anyone who wants to be wise in their relationship to God. In Psalms 41 and verse 1, how blessed is he who considers the helpless. The Lord will deliver him in the day of trouble. In the book of Proverbs, there are a number of proverbs that talk about the duty to be compassionate and generous in sharing with people in need. He who despises his neighbor sins, but happy is he who is gracious to the poor. Proverbs 19:17, he who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deeds. In Proverbs 21:13, he who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be answered. In Proverbs 28 and verse 27, he who gives to the poor will never want, but he who shuts his eyes will have many curses. So the best policy before God and in life is to be kind, to be sharing, to be generous, and do so knowing that the Lord will reward you. It's part of the teaching of the New Testament for us to be generous and to share with those in need. In Matthew 7:12, in the same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, therefore, however you want people to treat you, so treat them, for this is the law and the prophets. In the book of James, this is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father, to visit the orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So we have a religious duty to be kind, to try to be benevolent and helpful. And Jesus wants us to practice this almsgiving to please God and not to try to get credit for ourselves or seek the praise and approval of men. Who is it that we ought to help in the scriptures when we look more broadly at the teaching of truth? First of all, you have an obligation to take care of needy family members and meet their needs. You have a special obligation to those that are of the household of the faith, your brethren. And then as you have opportunity, we want to do good unto all men. And the needy are to be relieved. That's a responsibility to make sure that people do not fall into need. And orphans, widows, those that are maimed, those that are sick, those that are handicapped. In the ancient world, they didn't have the safety nets provided by the government that you see so often today. So it fell upon individuals, especially, to provide some kind of help. And even in this day of so many safety nets, we need to be compassionate people and practice these things. It's assumed by Jesus that this type of giving is going to take place. Giving is not to be indiscriminate, though, we're told in the scriptures. We don't just give to anybody, but we try to investigate, like Job, the circumstances of the case and recognize that giving to some people is actually harmful to them if they're going to use it in a way that feeds a destructive habit that they have that's going to hurt other people and themselves. Those that are healthy and just lazy and will not work, you should not encourage them in their idleness. We're told in 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10 that if a person will not work, neither let him eat. We need to encourage all to do their will, do their best, and to work. Again, let's look at verse 2. When therefore you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. So what Jesus is condemning here is advertising your giving to try to get self praise and congratulations, and having that as a chief motive rather than doing good because it is expected as a duty to God, and you want the rewards that God can give. The Pharisees made a display out of their giving. Jesus uses a figure of speech that they blow a trumpet so everybody notices them. In verse 1, the word that people notice you is the word for the theater, that we get the word theater from. It's to be a show-off. Not just that people might happen to see you do a good deed. There's nothing wrong with that. We're to do our good deeds and let our good deeds glorify God. But when we're doing it to be a show-off, to draw attention to ourselves, and we have that false motive involved, and it's pompous and self-praising giving of alms that's going on, that's what Jesus is condemning. And it's quite a figure of speech to see a person blow a trumpet to call people together so they can see you do some good deed. He uses the word hypocrites. A hypocrite is an actor and someone that is pretending to be something that they're not. They're pretending to do this to please God and to be a religious and righteous person, when really what they're seeking is self-praise for themselves. Jesus says there's no future reward that awaits you. You have received your reward in full. The word there for you have your reward, you have your wage in full. It was found in the deserts of Egypt, a number of papyrus scrolls that were found really in a junkyard in the land of Egypt that date back to the 1st century. And we find out a lot about the expressions that are found in the New Testament from those letters. And it had the idea that you have made your receipt. You've paid yourself in full. And you can't expect any more remuneration from God, because you've already gotten the praise you were seeking when you gave this thing. God does not reward us when we take praise and honor to ourselves. First of all, we're supposed to put God and his kingdom first. Remember when Herod was praised by the people that he had the voice of a God and not a man, and he didn't give glory to God? It says, and immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. So Jesus tells us we need to make sure that we give in a way that we're not trying to get the attention for ourselves. In verse 3, he says, but when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. This is how, again, not to give. As much as possible, keep your voluntary contributions a secret. Don't draw attention to yourself. God knows what you're doing, and the person you're helping knows what you're doing. It's an overstatement that Jesus uses oftentimes as a figure of speech, not letting your right hand know what your left hand is doing, or your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Your hands usually cooperate and work together in lifting things and carrying things, in carrying out things that you do. Of course, your hands don't literally know anything about the other, but it's a figure of speech. Be as secretive as you can in the things that you do. Be extremely discreet in your behavior so that you're not making it about you. Do your good deeds willingly and without thought about getting praise for yourself. It's not to have the attitude of what a good boy am I and praise yourself and seek praise from others. Guard against self-exaltation like the Pharisee who went before God in prayer and spent his time bragging on himself rather than asking for forgiveness. In looking at the scene of Judgment Day that's pictured in Matthew chapter 25 and verses 37 through 39, the good deeds of benevolence and caring that the people on Judgment Day that were righteous had shown towards Jesus by helping his brethren. On Judgment Day, he said, when did we visit you? When did we help you? When did we give you a drink? And when did... They were almost unaware of what Jesus was praising them for, because they weren't self-centered about the righteous deeds that they did. We are to give like Jesus Christ, that although he was rich, yet he became poor for us, that he might make us rich. In verse 4, so that your giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So give in secret, give discreetly, privately, in order that God is going to be able to reward you because he sees everything. So Jesus uses, again, rewards and punishments as motivation for us to do good and to deny evil. Not material rewards so much that he's thinking about in these promises, but about spiritual rewards that we're going to get in heaven, that God, being a righteous judge and seeing sacrifices that we make, is good and fair and will surely give us reward. We don't look at doing good deeds as earning our rewards in heaven in the sense of earning our salvation. We have faith in God's grace, God's plan of salvation, but we know that as we sacrifice and do good and help others, that God doesn't forget our righteous deeds and that he will reward us in the life to come. And so God is a rewarder of those who seek him and do his will, James tells us. And there's nothing that escapes his notice. Is something that's certainly implied in this passage. Whether you're out in the open where people can see you, or you're in your private home, if you're doing things in secret, no matter where you might be, God knows what you're doing, and he's aware of everything that you practice. The scriptures tell us time and again that God is all-seeing and all-knowing, and he knows what's in our hearts. He knows our motives and our desires. So there's nothing that we do that God doesn't know about. God knows everything that we do, and he'll reward it on the last day. If you do evil, that's a scary thing, because he'll recompense you for the deeds you've done that are wrong. But if you're doing righteous and you're walking by faith, then it's a great comfort and a great encouragement to do good, because we know God will recognize the things that we do because we believe in him and honor him. Also, we receive certain temporal rewards also, just in the ways of the laws of men and the laws of this world as God sent them up, according to God's providence. When you do good for others, it's a general rule, that good will come back to you. Sometimes many-fold it'll come back to you. You'll have the joy and the comfort that comes from having a good conscience because you're doing the things that you should. And you'll also be able to rejoice together with those that you are giving charity to and helping that are in need. So there's many, many blessings that come to us when we practice almsgiving and charity for the glory of God. In verse 5, and when you pray, you are not to be as the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogue and on the street corners in order to be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. So again, don't pray like the hypocrites do, that are praying in order to be noticed by men, that are putting on a show for men when they pray, hoping to be exalted in the eyes of men. If that's the motive, then the prayer is not doing any good as far as being addressed to God or being rewarded by God. The Jews had a great regard for prayer. They were a very praying people. They had almost no higher spiritual priority than to engage in prayer. But they also had many faults in their prayers because of false motives and purposes that entered in to the things that they were doing. When you have corrupt motives and you ask amiss, then your prayer is not heard, and it certainly won't be answered. What is condemned by Jesus here? Again, it's ostentatious prayer. It's prayer with this consciousness that other people are going to be looking at you and thinking that you are righteous and thinking you are especially religious. And so you're being a show-off. And your motive is mixed. It's not about God, but it's about you and about the attention that you get. So devotion in public is what is talked about, that is practiced in order to be seen, to be praised. It's picking conspicuous places that are considered holy, like going to the synagogue, going to the temple or whatever, and standing out in a way that everybody can see you practice your prayers and devotions in order to be thought highly of by them. Jesus says what you should do instead says, but you, when you pray, go into your inner room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. So Jesus talks about the opposite attitude that there ought to be. And he uses your inner room or your closet, the most isolated place that you can get away from others, as an example of the way that you seek for God and you practice your religion. It's not something that is about being seen by other people. And we shouldn't be concerned about seeing others. It's about our relationship to God, our asking of God the things that we need, and receiving from God the things that we need. And of course, Jesus practiced this often by going off in the mountains to pray, isolating himself from others in order to give himself in devotion to prayer, because it was to him about the connection and the fellowship that he was having with God, and he received his reward. If it's being done to receive the reward from men, then you're going to receive your reward now and not on the last day. This particular passage is not limiting where we can pray. He's using an illustration, talk about how we want to isolate ourselves from thoughts about people and pray. We have many examples of the apostles and righteous people praying out in a place where they might be seen with others, but they weren't doing it to be seen by others, is the point. It wasn't being offered up with thoughts about other people giving you praise, rather than doing what's right in the sight of God. So, verse 7, and when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetition as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. Another abuse of prayer that he mentions is turning your prayer into just some formal, ritualistic exercise and think that you do this regularly or often or more times, that's going to earn some special credit with God or impress people about how religious and righteous that you are. The Pharisees prayed on schedule to merit rewards with God. And that kind of prayer is not what God is looking for. They did so in order to be seen by men as being holy and righteous and very religious. Prayers were offered up, what's called the Shema. They put together the statements found in Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11, Deuteronomy 15. They added all of those sayings together. Oh, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then they would go through this whole recitation and do that repeatedly every morning and evening. This same repetition was used. They had another prayer called the 18, which was a set of prayers used in the synagogue service, and it was repeated 3 times a day. Again, it's not wrong that you have some regular time to your prayer that you try to devote yourself to, or that you pray 3 times a day as Daniel did. But the prayer is meaningful. You're doing it for the purpose of addressing God. You're not thinking that because you do these things you earn special credit with God some way or another. And you don't pray in such a repetitious and meaningless way of just repeating the same words that they don't have any meaning to you when you pray to God. A prayer for every activity and every event was practiced by the Jews, we're told by the ancient historians. They prayed at 9 every day, 12, noon, and also at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They had hours of prayer. They went to the holy place to pray. It became a ritual for men. And there was the danger that Jesus points out of it no longer being worshiped to God if you're not careful. And that seems to be what was happening. It lost its power to be an encouragement to them and to others because they just turned it into this repetitious ritual practice and this show that was put on for the eyes of other people to see. It was filled with meaningless repetition, that they used many, many words when just a few words would have worked just as well in order to impress others, or maybe even to earn credit with God. And Jesus condemns that type of prayer. This idea of using meaningless repetition that Jesus forbids here is something that the Jews were practicing, and it was something that the Gentiles practiced, that Jesus said is not the way that his disciples should be praying. You remember some examples in the Bible of this meaningless repetition and thinking it's going to cause actions to take place. When Paul was dragged into the amphitheater, or some of the disciples of Paul's friends were dragged to the amphitheater in Acts chapter 19, and they were saying that Paul was teaching against idols, and it was going to bring down Artemis of the Ephesians, or Diana of the Ephesians, as it says in the King James Version. And these pagans began to cry out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," and they repeated that shout, that chant, for 2 hours straight. That's the kind of meaningless repetition that we're talking about in this context. You remember when Elijah had the contest with the Baal worshipers on Mount Carmel, and he allowed them to go first, and they cried out and said, "O Baal, answer," or "O Baal, hear us." They said that same thing repeatedly for 6 hours, trying to get this pagan god to hear them. We're not to pray to our Heavenly Father in that way with meaningless repetition, thinking we're going to use a battering ram of prayer to get God to hear us and to answer and give us what we want, or to try to show how superior we are in religion, that we would shout something like that for 6 hours or 2 hours or whatever in a public way to draw attention to ourselves. An example that one commentator gave on this passage was in the Muslim religion. They sometimes have a ceremony where the people all shout "He" over and over and over again until they pass out as a religious devotion. Jesus said that's not what the Lord wants. That's not the way prayer should be addressed. In Catholicism, they have the counting of beads and the saying of the rosary, saying "Blessed is Mary, Mother of God," and they say it over and over and over, or "Our Father who art in heaven," and say that over and over and over and over. In order to show penance or to try to gain some credit with God. And that is what Jesus is saying we should not do. Those kind of prayers are condemned. In verse 7, "And when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetition as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words." Pharisees also offered long prayers to be impressive in the eyes of men. Maybe they thought it made them impressive in the eyes of God. Jesus says it doesn't. Numerous adjectives were added into their prayers that were unnecessary in order for them to express adoration and respect for God when they made a request. An example one writer gave of these type of prayers would be, "Blessed, praised, and glorified, exalted, honored, magnified, and lauded be the name of the Holy One." That is unnecessary. What does Jesus say in the model prayer that follows? "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name." That shows respect for God, worship for God. But it's not trying to impress other people by adding a bunch more adjectives, or trying to make yourself out to be more religious by adding adjective upon adjective in addressing God. They seem to have the attitude that more words equaled more meaning to God, or more length meant you were more religious in the eyes of men and God. The thought a lengthy prayer was more religious or righteous than a shorter prayer. And if we enter into that mindset, we're wrong. That's not what we should be doing. As you look at this context, Jesus is not condemning repetition of any kind in prayer. He's talking about meaningless repetition. Jesus prayed, David prayed using the same words several times in a row on different occasions. In the garden, Jesus prayed, "If it be thy will, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but thy will be done." He prayed that several times. The Apostle Paul, when he wanted to have that thorn in the flesh removed, he asked the Lord 3 times about that. The parable about the widow and the unrighteous judge, she importuned the judge as an example of being persistent in our prayers and requests and making those prayers known to God. So it's not condemning all repetition in prayer or using the same phrase or whatever, but it's condemning, again, meaningless repetition. Just saying these things as a chant or some kind of incantation or spell that we think is going to affect God. Elijah repeated the same prayer about the rain returning 7 times. So it's not just repetition, but meaningless repetition. We may sincerely repeat the same words in multiple prayers and even pray all night like Jesus prayed all night. So prayers can be long, but they're not to be made long to be praise for men or to think that a prayer is more religious or powerful because it's long. We should not make our prayers a show or put our trust in repeating a chant or in the length of our prayer. Finally, verse 8, so do not be like them, for your heavenly Father knows what you need before you ask him. So bear in mind when you're praying and you're communicating with God, that God knows the circumstances of the disciples' life and he knows your heart. He is not going to need to be buttered up by using a bunch of adjectives of praise in order to try to get him to listen better to what you're saying. Giving him long, detailed explanations that go on as if he doesn't know your needs is not necessary. All of one's reasons and feelings are known to God. And that's not to say God doesn't want you to pray and to talk to him and to tell him what's on your mind, because he commands us to do so. But don't think the number of words or the amount of praise that you heap on God is going to make your prayer more effective, more impressive. So prayer is not a means, one writer said, of gaining credit with God. And disciples always pray and should pray after the manner that the Lord showed us that's going to follow. Jesus gives us a model prayer, how we should form our prayers. He gives us an example of the type of prayer that the true child of God, disciple of Christ, ought to offer up. Pray then in this way: Our Father who art in heaven, there's praise for God, hallowed be your name. Pray about spiritual things first. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Pray about your material needs. Give us this day our daily bread. Be forgiving of others and desire others to be forgiven so you might be forgiven. And forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Next week we'll look more deeply into this model prayer. I hope that this lesson will be a blessing to you, that you'll think more deeply about these things, and that we'll all be better in our practice of righteousness and in gaining our reward with God. God bless you and be with you.